Hey guys, well, while I thought that this was going to be a simple and straightforward video, it turns out, like most things that I attempt, not so much, because I wind up getting in my own way. So the topic that I want to talk about is less about art techniques and a little bit more on the psychological basis of things that everyday people go through, but something that can maybe personally affect you in the way that it may inhibit you from doing what you love and what you're passionate about, or maybe what you're good at, because of beliefs that are kind of drummed into your head. And that's kind of what this painting is about. Currently in the computer it's listed as Project 1144. However, there are so many other things that this project has to do with, and it is a huge deviation from where my paintings normally are. So for those who are looking for something a little bit more lighthearted, unfortunately the Project 1144 videos are probably not going to be what you're looking for. There's not going to be a lot of explanation in techniques or color palette. This may be one of those projects that a lot of people can relate to, because a lot of people have been subject to really toxic, unsupportive environments and gaslighting and things that would be construed as possibly mental abuse and emotional abuse. And so this isn't necessarily one of those lighthearted, let's talk about, the fun of doing art, because this is something that's darker and grittier and uglier, and it goes beneath the surface, and it's one of the reasons why a lot of artists live with self-doubt and they never pursue their passions, and they find themselves in careers that they really truly despise. They're unhappy, and that's where they feel like they need to be. The reference pictures for this project have a really dark source. The color palette is exceptionally muted, except for a few bright colors. And I more want to talk in this episode about the mentality of why I'm making this piece. And I don't want to get into the personal details as much as I will say this is the third incarnation of the same scenario that I'm kind of working through, and something that I've been working through for months. And in hopefully working through it this time, I'll be able to get my demons out and hopefully help some other people maybe work through their own demons. So the topic at hand is how toxic people can destroy your creativity and why we let them. We always have, as creative people, whether you're a writer or you play music or you paint, you always have people in your life that'll cut you down, that doubt whether or not you can make it, and they'll tell you you don't have enough talent, that you have too much competition in your field. When I wanted to go into art in college or do it freelance, I was told that a lot. There was too much competition in the field and I wasn't good enough because my sisters weren't good enough, and so there was not going to be any support for me, either financially or emotionally, once I got out of high school, or even when I was in high school. It was very much treated as though it was a waste of time. A lot of people who find themselves in this position also find themselves when they try to not engage people who are toxic. in a very adult manner, and they want to talk, let's say, finances or business aspects of doing their art or doing whatever they feel passionate about. They want to have a very adult conversation about it. Other people will be very dismissive, saying that they're dreamers, or they have no idea about what they're doing. They have their head in the cloud, and they will start treating what is meant to be a very adult conversation in a very childish manner and start talking to you as though you're a child. And it's very hard, if not impossible, to have legitimate adult conversations on the topic of exploring your passions as a business with people like that, because they will automatically dismiss you, no matter how non-emotional you can be, because some of us can be very emotional when we're talking about our passions and wanting to be heard. And some of us have found out through the years that getting emotional and showing that this means a lot to me, will you please have this conversation with me because I value your input, they will actually almost get off on the fact that they can get under your skin and get you upset. And so that will cause them to almost treat you more like a child and dismiss you more the more emotional you get and the more passionate you get about the subject that you want to talk about. I've had it happen quite a bit where I've seen people who are being dismissed for their passions and for the things that they think that they can do in the world. I've heard them, name calling is quite common in bullying, but I've heard it just being done with people who are just passionate about what they want to do. So yes, name calling and comparing you to somebody else that is considered to be a failure who gave up on their dreams, that's something that's real common. Being unrealistic could be something that gets said a lot. People who are very toxic to people who are creative and want to get them to stop, or just don't believe that they have what it takes, will start giving compliments, but they will be very much double-sided compliments. It will be very much, I will give you this compliment to shut you up and get you to go away, because now you're just being a bother. I found that quite often, that if I asked for feedback on my artwork from my parents, I would get "that's nice" or "that's pretty." It was a very generic compliment, and it wasn't anything really critiquing of anything, like, you know, you could use some more contrast here, your balance is off here, your lines are not right. And they would become very generic in their compliments, and I started to not want to believe anything that they said as far as a compliment. So it became one of those things in high school where I learned that looking for validation from certain people and getting compliments from those people actually was invalidating. It was doing the exact opposite. So if I accomplished something, like with my art, I would actually start to believe I was doing worse if they complimented me, because everything was very backhanded. You know, if you said you were doing something nice, it came with the added pros of needing favors, or, well, you can do good in this, so then you better be able to do well in this other thing over here. It's completely unrelated. The backhanded compliments come with the need to be perfectionists and being overcritical in your own processes and your own executions of what you want to see your work be. And I have found that with myself, where I will not want to release work that I don't think is perfect. It's beyond the whole, it's not quite up to my expectations. I have to have it exactly the way that it is in my head, and if I don't have it exactly that way, then I'm not worthy and I can't release it. It also is a huge well for breeding insecurities and unrealistic expectations. So when you start with that stuff, I'll give you an example with myself. It's like, I have a friend who also has a YouTube channel, and she's been doing it for several years. She is a professional art teacher. I consider her a very good art teacher, and that is her forte. And since a lot of people have ever asked me about my techniques, which I have a slightly different style from her, even though we both do pet portraits, because I can't explain it as well as her, or I can't get as good of a following as her, I would consider myself a failure in doing anything. And it became very discouraging, and it was one of those things where you find yourself on a downward spiral. And it comes from a lot of years of just, well, if you failed at this, then you suck at life. People who are toxic will belittle your ambitions. They'll say that you can never live on the money that you would earn, which happened a lot when I was trying to pursue different majors in college. It didn't matter what the major was, it was never the major that apparently was what my parents wanted to hear. And so despite having the ambitions to do a lot of different fields, it was never what my parents wanted to hear, so it was never good enough. And so a lot of things that I possibly could have been really successful at, I gave up at before I even tried, because either the field wasn't good enough because it wasn't what my parents wanted to hear, or I wasn't good enough. And so there was a lot of killing the cow before it even got to slaughter kind of thing, and just leaving it out in the field. And that's why this particular piece has a gruesome amount of gritty violence in it, and it's because there were so many things that I realized that I gave up on that I could have pursued, and maybe I could have been great at them. There was a couple of things that I was real passionate about that I pursued on my own, and I found out that's just not the kind of field for me. One of them was veterinary medicine, and I found out that there's just things that people do to pets that make it very hard as a vet to do your job. It makes it very hard at the end of the day to go home and be okay with going back the next day. And as an adult, my parents have pushed me and my family has pushed me to get into the medical field, and I thought, well, if this is what people do to their pets, what the hell do they do to other people? And then all I have to really do is look at the way that I've been supported in my art from my family, and then go, yeah, that is not a road I want to go down, and that's not something that I have ever been able to explain to my family, that emotionally that's not, the healthcare field is not something that I would emotionally be able to do. When people do a lot of this stuff when you are in your formative years of belittling your ambitions and cutting you down, the lack of validation leads to validating seeking behavior, which is where you're, hey, I did this, please tell me it's okay, please tell me it's good enough. And when you don't get that, you want to give up. So you try something else, and you try something else. And it's part of how people are hardwired to be accepted as part of a group, and how mentally, people are hardwired to live in the groups and to be accepted as part of the groups. So when you don't get the validation for the efforts that you put in, you are depressed, you're anxious, you're trying to find a way to possibly get accepted, and it can lead to some really unhealthy doubts and insecurities that cause you to stop doing what you actually enjoy. Another thing that people with real toxic behaviors will do, and people who don't support you in your creative endeavors, is that they will persuade you to do other ambitions, take on other responsibilities that take you away from the things that you think are, the things you love to do. They will continually promote a career change. That is very typical of like me doing my art. It didn't matter how many ways I brought it up, in what kind of context that I brought it up. It was deemed as very childish and not something that was supportable, something that was not a realistic expectation, and very much do this and stop talking about this other thing because we don't want to hear it. And part of it is a need to be correct. Some of it is a need to be practical, and some of it is just their own past experiences. My father was very big in schooling for trade. That was something that was very much needed in the workforce. And part of his decision was based on my sister's previous experiences in college. And so if my sisters weren't good enough and they changed their majors, then I was not going to be good enough based on their experiences. And looking back on it, that wasn't a fair assessment. I wasn't really given a chance to explore what I could have done. And on the same point, it was kind of the thing of, I'm kind of, at this point in my life, glad that I didn't go into school for the arts, because I would not have been the same person I am now. I probably would have had not explored the market the way I have, and I might be living under a corporate thumb, which would, I don't know if at the time it would bug me. I know a lot of corporate artists who are marketeers or that do animation for Disney or for Marvel or what, and they aren't necessarily happy with their jobs. And right now, because I didn't take that venue, I'm not saddled with the overlords of a corporation and my art. I can just kind of do as I please with my art, and that's kind of a liberating thing. If I want to draw fantasy, I can. And if I want to learn more about the business, then I can also. But it was very much when I was in high school wanting to pursue it, treated as though I would never be good enough or smart enough to pursue it. And even as an adult, after I got out of high school and I was making successful sales and I was making extra cash on the side with it, it was very much blown off by my father, and it became kind of a rift between me and my dad. Some other tactics that I do want to bring up have more to do with something that maybe you may find from not so much older people, being your parents, guardians, aunts, uncles, teachers, and more from things that I've observed from maybe classmates, your peers, and your siblings, and that is the direct bullying that goes with being successful in a creative field, and that's flat out bullying. And it's the name calling and being fun of because you're the odd kid out. God only knows that I've been subject to quite a bit of that. Physical abuse, and that just kind of goes hand in hand with bullying, and it goes in with the next point, which is destruction of materials and supplies and pieces. I've had pieces that have been destroyed on the bus coming home from school, forcing me to completely start it all over or go back to school the next day in tears. I've had my parents not necessarily approve of certain pieces and throw them out. And the other thing that kind of ties into that is when you combine some of these other psychological factors when it goes on for a real prolonged time. On a spiral that I noticed that my mom would get into when she would have her bipolar is that when she felt really down on herself and she would get down on her own self-esteem and her ability to cope with things, is that she would not just destroy pieces that she felt were unsuccessful. She would get rid of her brushes and her paints and her papers, and she wouldn't buy cheap paper. She would buy like some of the most top line end of paper. And I have to say that while we're talking about this, better material doesn't make you a better artist. It makes your stuff look better. You know, archival paper or smoother paints, but it's not going to make you personally a better artist. It's not going to magically make the pieces come out of your head onto the paper the way that you want them. Another form of bullying could be exclusion from group activities or conversations. That happened a lot as a kid and a young adult and as an adult, where I wasn't allowed to participate in conversations, whether it had to do with like legitimate things like wills and estate planning or insurance, because I was an artist and I wouldn't understand. I have been a victim of gaslighting, where I've been told what happened was not actually what happened, and the narrative had been changed. And the problem with that is if you wind up being a victim of a lot of these other symptoms, you start to fall victim to people rewriting the past and gaslighting events that happened as a young adult or as a kid. And honestly, if you feel like this might be something that's going on, my first thing is to start a journal. I started journaling when I was in second and third grade, and I kept those, and I had to keep them hidden in my mattress, and then would find a trend with things being told to me later that were not as they actually had been, as I had written them down. And found out that I was not the only one being bullied in situations, that fear tactics had been used on, and so other people's narrative of what had happened had been changed in order to have them feel safe in a situation. So gaslighting can be used not only for protection of themselves, but as a way of protecting you, because if you deny something that happened, then it's less liable that the person who instigated the problem actually will come back at that person for, you know, going over this infraction, whether it's, you know, physical abuse or drug abuse or theft or whatever the infraction is. To pretend that it didn't happen or that it was made up seems to be a way that some people have of dealing with it. But if you keep a journal of it, it's easier for you to realize you're getting gaslit, rather than people continuing to make you believe that you're wrong. So with all of this really nasty thing that happens with physical abuse and mental abuse and emotional abuse, why do we put up with this? And it has everything to do with how people as a society are wired, and individual people. We value other people's opinions of us, and we take those opinions seriously. And those are generally friends and family, spouses, well-respected strangers. If you have an artist that you respect, you may take their critique far more seriously than you would if it was just your spouse who knew nothing of the subject. People who are considered well-respected critics, we may take overly serious and take their critique of our work overly personally and internalize that to our own person. So if they say your work is unbalanced and shit, then you may turn around and say, well, I'm unbalanced and shit, and I shouldn't do this, and I'm a horrible person. And that's not a healthy way to look at things. But again, that's a way that you would internalize that. But then again, there's the whole thing of why do we care? And a lot of it is having an objective outside perspective. People who are toxic will tell you what they want to hear to make you into something that they want. And that's something really important to understand. They want you to be what they want, not necessarily what you want. And that's the difference between somebody who's got a healthy perspective and giving you healthy advice and somebody who's just out for themselves. Toxic people may not give you advice that's the best advice for you. They may not be supportive, they may be very manipulative, and it may be in very subtle ways that it's hard for you to see. And they do it for power, control. They may do it for social status. They may do it for a perceived and misguided notion of what's right versus what's wrong, or to protect you against fears of you succeeding where they failed and making them look bad. And all of those factors are psychological factors that they possess, that they are now imposing upon you. I guess my last point is what point do you decide you're going to walk away? And my notations here have been basically based on my own personal accounts. If you're yielding so much power in your life to somebody else that you're no longer happy, it's time to really seriously reconsider walking away from that relationship. When discussions and encounters do more harm than good, when you leave this conversation and you're depressed, you're hopeless, you feel like a failure, you want to give up, and then when anticipation of these encounters put you in such a state that it literally interrupts your daily activity until it passes. And then the post-encounter takes even longer to recover it. So let's say you have a 6-hour, you're supposed to meet your parents for 6 hours for dinner. And it means that for weeks before, you're looking for landmines and conversations to avoid, and fights and conflicts during dinner. You have sleepless nights and you have anxiety-ridden days beforehand, and afterwards you leave depressed for weeks. You're wondering what you're doing, and you're fighting the doubts and fears that have now been reinforced from these toxic people that they dump into your system. When you spend more time going back and forth before and after encounters with these people than you spend with them, and you leave yourself unable to relax enough to get any work done, or you're so upset that sometimes it's impossible to regulate and get back into a normal routine, then it's time to reevaluate whether or not you need to nurture those relationships. It can be something from a creative perspective. It can be just something from an everyday perspective. There is no limit to the amount of power-controlling toxic people that are out there. That is a lot of what this piece is about.